Hi folks. I've had a few people ask me recently about the FEM solver, and so I wanted to share a few things I've learned, since it's one of those shadowy areas of Houdini that doesn't necessarily get as much attention as a lot of the other solvers. Now, I'm actually not going to talk at all about what's maybe the most standard, or at least the most familiar workflow, using FEM to add fleshy, soft body dynamics to existing animated rigs. For that, I'll direct you to Emily Fung's excellent hug workshop. Instead, I wanted to spend some time talking about how you can use some of FEM's muscle attributes to drive motion procedurally. To that end, I'm going to cover 3 different mini projects. We'll start with a very basic setup, using noise to drive our dynamics, which should get us comfortable with the core principles. We'll also take this opportunity to cover wrinkly skin dynamics, one of the most fun elements of the FEM solver. Next, we'll ditch the randomness in favor of periodic functions, and we'll look at how to use muscles and target constraints to drive a simple Inchworm-style locomotion. Finally, we'll move to an entirely reactive setup, with a sort of tentacled anemone-type creature that responds to a secondary target geometry. As always, you can find the HIP for these on my website, so without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so let's get started with our first setup. I'm just going to drop down a geometry node here, and I'll call this one noise, because we're basically going to be doing all of our dynamics using noise. So I'm going to jump in here, and the first thing we want is a little bit of geometry to play with. We're going to do something real basic, so let's just put a sphere in here, and we're going to want this to be polygons. And I'm going to bump up this resolution a bit to something like this, and that'll be a pretty good place to start. So for FEM, what we're ultimately doing is taking a mesh like this, which is just surface polygons, and we can see that pretty easily. Drop a clip here. We just have this shell. That's what our normal meshes look like. What FEM does is it replaces this sort of surface-based geometry with an entire volume, and it makes a tetrahedral mesh. So tetrahedron is one of these guys, so it's just like a triangular volume unit. This is technically a little simplex. So FEM basically builds a volume out of all of these little tetrahedra to fill the space that the mesh occupies. And the advantage to this is it lets it simulate the entire interior of your mesh. So if you have built-up forces, if you have strain, all of that stuff going on inside of a volume, it simulates all of that stuff. So to have an FEM simulation, we need to convert our meshes into that kind of tetrahedral representation. And there's 2 basic ways to do this. We have solid embed and solid conform. And they do very similar things. They're both going to generate a tetrahedral mesh. The basic way to think about this is that solid embed is going to try to build like a cage around your geometry. So you can see here it's built all of these tetrahedra, and they're sitting sort of around the geometry we fed in. And this can be really good if your geometry has sort of irregular topology, or if it has like little very fine details that you don't really need to capture or simulate. In a lot of workflows, you're going to want to use solid embed because your geometry probably isn't in a really nice triangulated form with nice evenly sized triangles and triangles that aren't overly large. So in general, for most things, you'll use solid embed. But for something really simple, like this sphere we have here, that has relatively sort of coarse representation, we can actually use solid conform. And what solid conform will do is it will take that surface geometry that you have, and it will use those. It'll make sure that it uses those points on its tetrahedra. So this doesn't look like it's done anything, but if we go up here on info, we just have polygons. Once we've done conform, we have tetrahedrons. And if we drop our clip here, you can see that the entire interior has been filled now with these little tetrahedral elements. So solid conform will sort of keep that surface geometry, and in this case it actually does a better job than solid embed does, because we already have this sphere that knows exactly how to sort of triangulate its surface in a very regular way. That's kind of built into this primitive. So solid conform is a good bet for us here, because we get a really nice fidelity to this sort of original shape. But in a lot of use cases, you'll probably want to use solid embed, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later. So for now, we'll use solid conform, and this gives us a bunch of nice tetrahedra, and this is basically all we really need to go ahead into our FEM solver. So at this point, we could just drop a null, call this FEM geo, and go straight into DOPS. But what I want to do for this lesson is talk a little bit about fibers. And fibers are basically how FEM sort of handles muscles. And what it does is it defines at every point. So this entire geometry is filled with points on the interior now. At every point, you can specify a preferred direction in space. And that direction is the fiber direction. And once you've set that up, if you control the fiber scale, you can tell the whole thing to contract or expand along that direction. And what's interesting about this, these directions can go in any given way. They're specified on the point-by-point basis. So we could set up a uniform direction for the whole thing, or we could set up sort of directions within the entire material. And we're just going to sort of take a look at that idea in this particular setup. So if we want these muscle fibers, we're going to need to define some attributes. So I'm just going to go ahead and drop an attribute wrangle. And we don't need very much here. The main thing we need is a property called material W. This W is because this is one component of UVW. So you can actually specify directions, sort of all three directions. And you can define these sort of UVs, or these three-dimensional UVs, which are basically like material coordinates. You can define these in a variety of different ways. But if you're just doing fibers, the only one that you actually care about is material W. And so this is just a vector pointing in some preferred direction. So just for the sake of argument, let's initialize this to, say, the z-axis here. So that's the first parameter we're going to need. And there's two fiber properties we can play with. One is fiber scale, and this just says sort of how long along this preferred axis, so how much stretch or compression do we want along material W. And so 1.0 is basically no change, less than 1 is a contraction, and greater than 1 is an expansion. So let's just set this to some starting value just so we can have a feel for how this works. And the last thing we'll probably want to set up is a property called fiber stiffness. And basically, when you set up material properties in FEM, you're going to set up a variety of different stiffnesses. This is how it controls how the overall sort of shape, how the dynamics go on in the interior. Fiber stiffness basically says take whatever the existing stiffness is and multiply it by this amount only in the direction of the fiber. And so this basically allows us to set up a more or a less stiff muscle than the surrounding sort of tissue, if we want to think of it in those terms. So in general, you'll want your fiber stiffness to be sort of greater than 1. You want it to basically be sort of stronger than whatever else is around it. And so I'm going to go ahead and set this to something like, let's just set it to 10 for now. We might change this later. But this is basically just sort of setting up some preliminary properties so we can see something happening. So let's just call this setup fibers. And now let's go ahead and jump into our dot network. We'll go in here, and to get us started, we can actually build what's probably sort of the simplest dot setup you'll ever see. We just want our solver and our solid object, and sort of nothing else. So this is a really, really nice, simple setup. We're going to tweak this a little bit, but ultimately, FEM setups aren't that complex. So on the solid object here, this is where we want to bring in our geometry, and so we want to go to the deformation tab here. And our initial state is where we want to point to that FEM geometry we just made. So I'll bring that in here, and sure enough, there it is. And for now, that's pretty much all we need to set up here. So if I were to run this at this point, it's not going to do very much, but it will actually, based on what we set up here, we should see it stretching to about double its size along the z-axis. So let's just play. And sure enough, it sort of pops itself out along that axis, and we get some sort of interesting kind of dynamics going on there, in part because that stiffness is really, really strong. It's pushing, it's kind of kicking out very sort of, it's giving a big initial kick, which is giving this kind of fun distortion at the beginning, but then it's sort of settling out into that position. So that's not super useful, but it is showing us sort of that material W is functioning just fine, and that our stiffness is really sort of pushing against whatever stiffness the structure itself has, this sort of object has, and that will basically get us started. Now, defining just a static material W and a static fiber scale out here isn't all that interesting. For a lot of setups, you probably won't want to change material W, but changing fiber scale is how you're going to get sort of interaction. You're going to get sort of movement and changes here. So let's start with a really simple example. Let's just set this back to 1. And what we want to do instead is sort of drive fiber scale. And just for the sake of argument, I'm just going to sort of drive it with a periodic function. So to do this, we need some way to change fiber scale within our dot network, so during these simulation steps. And usually you would think, okay, we'll probably need something like a SOP solver, and we just plug that into a pre-solve. But you'll notice that the FEM solver doesn't have a pre-solve or a post-solve or really any input except for the object input. So this is a very sort of bare bones solver in terms of what's accessible to the user. So if we want to do anything, we basically need to reconfigure this setup. And what we want to do is drop down a multiple solver. And these seem fancy or daunting if you haven't worked with them before, but they're actually really, really straightforward. All they're saying is take some object, pipe that through, and apply every solver piped into this sort of purple bar here, apply all of them in order to this same object. So if all we did was pipe the FEM solver in here with the single solid object, the multiple solver is basically just saying, run this solver on this object. And so that's not going to change anything. And in fact, since we set our fiber scale to 1, nothing at all will happen here. What this means, though, is that we can also drop a SOP solver in here. And if we wire this in and just make it go first, oops, I mixed everything up here, hang on, wire that in, wire these in this order. So now our SOP solver is basically acting as a pre-solve. So it's going to be applied to this object before the FEM solver is. And so that means anything we do in the SOP solver, that's how we can change the properties on our solid object. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do a really basic version. Let's just say that our fiber scale, let's just give it a periodic function. Let's say our fiber scale will be equal to, I'm going to use fit11. I'll unpack this in a second. Let's just drop down time, and we'll go from range 0.2 to 1 point, maybe even 2 point. There we go. So what does this all say? Well, sine of time times 2 basically just means roughly every 3 seconds we're going to get a full cycle. Sine is going to return -1 to 1, so I use this fit11, which means fit from the range -1 to 1 to some other range, and I'm going to fit that from 0.2 to 2. And basically this means roughly every 3 seconds we're going to be sort of ranging from contraction by 5 times to doubling. And so if we run this, every step we're going to basically update our fiber scale throughout this model, and it's going to follow this periodic function, and it should just sort of pulse in and out. So if we run this, sure enough, it stretches out, compresses in, stretches out, and so you can see that it's really easy to sort of control our fiber scale inside a SOP solver, and we can start to get sort of motion being produced this way. Now, what I want to do for this setup is actually sort of randomly change, using some noise, both the material W, so both the direction of the fibers, and this fiber scale. And that's going to give us some really interesting dynamics. It's going to give us this sort of churning blob shape here. So let's just go back out here, and let's sort of initialize our material W to nothing. It's not going to like this value, but basically just so that we don't have anything coming in, this just feels more natural. So we'll just initialize these variables, but we're not actually going to use any of these values except for fiber stiffness. Now in here, I'm going to sort of get rid of this value, and what I want to do at the outset is just reinitialize everything. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set our material W, make sure that's a vector, so V at material W, I'm going to set that to 0, just keep that where it was. And I'm going to set our fiber scale to 1. And so this is basically a baseline. And now I'm going to use our handy SOP attribute noise. So we want to start with material W. So we're going to keep our signature 3D because we want 3D noise. We want a vector somewhere in space. And we're going to keep our mode to additive because we just initialized this to 0. So we're just going to generate some noise, and we're going to add it to this value of 0. That's why we do this reinitialization step. So we don't want to add it on every step to the previous material W. We just want to cancel it out and then add a new one using this noise. We're going to call this material W. And instead of using P, I actually want to use this variable you can see here, which is base P. And this gets created by the solver as soon as you start. Basically, when you set up this solid object, it basically says, okay, where are all of these positions at the beginning? As soon as we sort of bring it in from this FEM geo, where are they at that frame 1 or the first frame of the simulation? We're going to store that as base P. And so as we move, as the simulation updates, this thing will sort of turn and move around and stretch. And so the individual P values for these points are going to be changing. I want to apply my noise to base P, basically to its rest space. So we're going to use that attribute base P for our location to drive the noise, and we're going to create material W. The only other things I want to do, I won't bother changing any of these noise parameters. This will all work fine for the scale that we're dealing with here. I do want to center the noise because we want both positive and negative values. Otherwise, we'll all just point upwards into this positive, or I guess where's positive. Otherwise, all our noise will point this way in our sort of positive direction, positive quadrant. We want it to be centered. We want to be able to have directions in every direction. And then I'm also going to animate this. And so that means over time, the noise that we're creating will shift and sort of pulse and move around. So now we've set up our fiber directions, and we get some random noise-driven fiber directions everywhere at each point. I'm going to quickly normalize this. So I'm going to say v-at material w equals normalize v-at material w. You don't necessarily need to do this, but it's a bit cleaner. And of course, this is giving us uniformly in the range basically for that amplitude minus 0.5 to 0.5 on each axis. So we're actually getting basically a square volume of noise. So we want to make sure that we normalize this. So that's going to give us random directions for our fibers. Now we just want some random scales. So we can use another attribute noise. Oops. This one we want to be one-dimensional because we're generating a float. This is just our fiber scale. We're going to apply it to base P again, and we actually want this to be multiplicative. Because we're starting, we initialize to 1, so we're going to multiply this value of 1 by whatever we put in here. That means the range that we give is going to be the range that we get out. Over base P, fiber scale, so we want to animate this as well. We don't need to center it, but we do want to remap it. We want to specify our minimum and our maximum. And let's just go ahead and use those values we had before. I think that was 0.2 and 2. And so now we're getting a random scale and a random direction that's sort of animating over time. And if we run this, we get this kind of fun churning blob effect, which is of course not super useful, but it does give us this sort of interesting shape that we can play with and maybe use for some other things. So that's working out okay. I'd like to do a few more things here. The first thing I want to do is sort of get a nice, better resolution mesh on here. And this is one of the really nice things about FEM, and one of the sort of main things about the FEM workflow is that you simulate on this sort of coarse representation, but then you can apply these changes, these deformations, to something a lot more high res. And we actually don't do this in the normal sort of point deform way. The FEM solver itself actually supports embedding geometry, and it does a kind of fit, it does a deformation of your embedded geometry in an even better way than point deform will. So let's take a look at setting that up. We'll head back out here to SOPs, and we'll take our original base geometry. And what we'll do here is just subdivide this. I'm going to use open subdiv loop so I keep my triangles, and I'm going to go up to, say, 3 levels. This gives me a sort of nice high-resolution mesh here compared to our original one. But critically, this mesh is still basically entirely, what do I want here? There we go. This mesh is still basically either contiguous with or inside of our tetrahedral mesh. And this is really important. When you have your high-resolution geometry, you want it to be, at worst case, overlapping sort of directly with the surface of those tetrahedra. And ideally, it's nice to have it actually fully encased. What you don't want is to have your geometry sticking outside of your tetrahedral mesh, because that basically means it's going to have to make sort of an extrapolation of how it should be deformed, and it will still work, but it won't look as good, and it won't be sort of mapped as nicely. And of course, it won't be simulated at all. So you want to make sure that your sort of embedding geometry is, in the worst case, basically completely overlapping with the surface of your tetrahedral mesh, and in the best case, it should be entirely inside. Okay. So that's all we really need to set that up, and if we wanted, we could even throw some UVs on here, so let's just get some polar UVs, and I'll drop down another null, and I'll just call this EMBD for embedding. Now we can go back into our dot network and go onto our solid object, and you'll see on this deformation tab, way at the bottom here, we have this embedding tab. And so we can check this, and what you'll see, if we just look at our solid object over here, we have this geometry container, so that's the standard container that's holding our tetrahedral mesh. If we enable our embedding geometry, you can see it creates another geometry container. So this little box means that this container is storing geometry. This is empty right now, but if we point to our high resolution mesh here, our EMBD, now we have that mesh being stored in this embedded geometry container. And when the FEM solver updates, it doesn't just update geometry, it will also update this embedded geometry. And that's critical, and it's a distinction between sort of the point-to-form workflow, because what you can't do is run a FEM simulation and then figure out what your embedded geometry is. You need to specify it at the outset, because it actually gets updated as the simulation updates. So embedded geometry is going to be changed as this simulation changes. So if I run forward, you can see that these values are also changing. So you want to make sure your embedded geometry is specified before you sort of cache out your simulation. Now if we run this again, you can see that it looks basically the same. We don't really get any of that extra high resolution. So what's going on here? Well, by default, we're going to be looking at geometry. That's sort of the main thing that we see, and we're always going to see that in dots. So if we want to look at our embedded geometry, we're going to have to import that. So let's go back to stops, and we'll just drop down a dot import. And I'll drag our .NET here, and I'll just do star solid star to make sure we're getting that solid object. And we want to fetch geometry. Now by default, the geometry it fetches will be the container called geometry. That's the one that, if you don't specify geometry data path, that's the one it'll look for, because basically any solver that has geometry is going to by default store it in the geometry container. But if you have multiple containers, you can specify some other name here. And so in our case, we can just write embedded geometry, and now we get our high resolution geometry coming out here. Now you can see just a little bit here, especially if I catch sort of the light just right in the viewport here, you can see that sort of it gives this nice smooth shape. It's doing a really good job of deforming this thing based on that underlying mesh. But of course, you are still limited by your base tetrahedral mesh. So if we look at sort of these sort of diamond shapes here, this is basically because we have that triangular mesh underlying it. And so that information is basically being carried over, and there's only so much that you can get from the high resolution mesh. You're still going to be constrained by that underlying one. You can fix a lot of that with even something like a smooth. You can already basically get rid of a lot of those sort of pieces there, and if you bump that up even farther, you get an even nicer sort of shape. So in general, you can actually go quite far with your high resolution mesh, even with a relatively low resolution underlying geometry. So this still looks pretty good. But of course, it's always worth noting that you are constrained, ultimately, by your simulated resolution. And, you know, that's fairly intuitive. So the other thing I wanted to talk about with this setup was this sort of turning blob thing gives us a nice context for looking at skin effects in FEM. And this is one of the sort of fun things that we can do with the FEM solver that a lot of the other solvers, you know, it's a lot harder to do. You could potentially sort of fake it in Vellum, but skin is really nicely supported in FEM. And this is what gives you a lot of your interesting creature effects and creature dynamics, because if you think about sort of an animal, you have your bones driving your muscle, and you have a fat layer, and then you have skin sitting on top. And the reason you get wrinkles in skin is because skin is its own shell. It's basically a layer that's sitting on top of all that stuff that moves underneath. And so when the things move underneath, they deform the skin, but they're not rigidly locked together. So in FEM, we can basically define a skin layer on top of our interior dynamics, and by tweaking sort of the stiffness and the constraints of that skin layer, we can get some nice wrinkles going on here. So let's take a look at that workflow. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to our original sphere, and I want to bump up this resolution a bit. Once we're looking at skin, we basically need our base geometry, our simulated geometry, to have enough resolution to support wrinkles. So right now we could get some pretty large ridges and folds, but I want to bump this up a little bit so we can get some sort of smaller details and some just like really nice wrinkles in here. I'm going to bring this up to, let's say, maybe even 12. Basically I want to keep my solid conform total, yeah, somewhere around 11,000. That's not so bad. We could go a lot higher than this, of course. I just wanted to be able to sort of update fast enough that we can do something useful here. But we still have enough detail that we can probably get some interesting little ridges and folds from this. So to get skin, what FEM wants is not just a tetrahedral mesh, but actually some polygons as well. So by default, a solid object is just tetrahedrons. When we want skin, we're actually going to use what we call a hybrid object, because it's a hybrid of tetrahedrons and also a layer of polygons. So if we look at this object here, we don't actually have any polygons. We have points, primitives, vertices, and tetrahedrons. We want an extra layer of polygons here. And this is something Solid Conform can do nicely. We just check this box, add surface triangles. And now you can see we have the tetrahedra on the inside, but we also have this layer of polygons on the outside. And if we toggle over here, you can see that now we have points, primitives, vertices, polygons, and tetrahedra. So by clicking this, we basically get an extra skin layer. And FEM will understand this if we use a hybrid object. I'm going to go ahead and sort of add a special group for those exterior polygons, because what I'd like to do is apply all of our material W, all of our sort of fiber scale updates to the interior stuff, but not to the skin directly. I just want the skin to respond to what's going on inside here. So let's make a group for our skin. I'll call this skin. And we can do something really easy here, because you can see that these are polygons. They are the only polygons. So we can actually go in our base group to geometry filter and select just polygons. And so now, if we click, well, we've just made a group. If we split on this group, we split on skin, you can see that now we just have the polygons coming through in that skin group, and we just have the tetrahedra coming in on that remaining group. So we'll pipe this in through here. We'll set up these values again. All of that is fine. Nothing else really needs to change out here in SOPs. But now let's go into our dot network. And we want to replace this solid object with a hybrid object. So here's that. We're going to have mostly the same properties here, so we'll go to deformation. We'll point that to our initial geometry, FEM-geo. And we're going to go to our embedded geometry here, and we'll grab that EMBD. I just want to check that. How big is this now? Oh, it's still not so bad. We had sort of higher resolution to begin with, and we subdivided the same amount, so I just wanted to make sure it wasn't too crazy. But yeah, this is a nice sort of high resolution mesh, but it's not, it's not going to bog anything down. Okay. So we'll head back into DOPS. So we're just going to swap out our solid object for our hybrid object. And I'm going to go into our SOP solver here, and I just want to use that skin group to restrict what we're doing. This is fine, but when we do our noise, I want to just apply this to anything except skin. Same here, and same for our fiber scale. So we're basically just going to apply it to the non-skin tetrahedra. Now on the hybrid object, you can see that we have on the model tab, I guess we didn't even look at the model tab before, on a solid object on the model tab, we have things that control the stiffness of this object. So we have an overall stiffness for the entire shape, that'll multiply these other values, and then we have a shape stiffness and a volume stiffness. And these are best understood just by playing around with values here. They are interdependent, so you can't really treat them as totally independent or orthogonal. You don't want to drop either of them to 0, you don't want to go crazy high with either of them. You want them to be sort of balanced in a way. So these default values are fine for what we're doing right now. But in general, volume stiffness is trying to preserve the volume. So if you allow shape stiffness to be really low, but volume stiffness really high, what you'll get is something that deforms really nicely, but still preserves its overall volume. If you have a really high shape stiffness, then it's basically going to try to maintain its contour, its overall shape, in addition to trying to maintain its volume. So you can play with these different values. This default will give you something soft, something that will squish, but preserve its overall volume reasonably well. Now on a hybrid object, we have both a shell and a solid. And so the solid has the same properties as a basic solid object, so it has overall and then shape and volume. The shell, which is the exterior polygons, has a thickness value and a shape stiffness and a bend stiffness. And so I'm just going to move over to a little visualization I made, because to understand how to get nice wrinkles, we want to understand this shape and bend stiffness. And if you hover over them, shape stiffness says this is basically resisting deformation tangent to the shell, so that's along the surface. Bend stiffness, it says, is resisting local deformation in the direction normal to the shell. so pointing out. And basically what this ultimately means is that, well, I'll show you the visualization. Let's go out here. I have this stiffness demo over here. And right away we see something we're going to see a lot, probably in this tutorial. If you've used Houdini a bit, you've probably seen this before. The scene view often sort of forgets how to update itself, and we have geometry that's not actually visible anywhere, but it forgets to get rid of it. Sometimes you can just toggle away and back, but often you have to basically create an entirely new scene viewer and get rid of the old one for it to update properly, because that thing wasn't really there. I've found, while working with FEM, that this happens a lot, especially when I'm doing FEM. I don't really know exactly what makes Houdini upset this way, but it's easy enough to fix. It just means we're going to be creating a lot of extra scene views every time our geometry doesn't update correctly in the viewer here. But now we're fine. And so what I've got here are two identical spheres. I basically did sort of the same setup that we looked at before. The only difference is I initially measured the area of each primitive here, and then I just moved one copy over to one side, one copy to the other side, and inside our dot network, I had one of these objects with very high shape stiffness and no bend stiffness on the skin, and the other one has no shape stiffness but very high bend stiffness. When I bring them back out with the import, I measure the area again, and I basically just calculate an area ratio. So let's just go ahead and visualize that. And so if I play here, let's give ourselves a bit more space. Okay, so what we can see here, on this side we have the high bend stiffness, on this side the high shape stiffness. And you can see just by looking, the shape stiffness is starting to get these little folds. They're not very dramatic in this case, but critically, none of these are changing color. Over here we have a lot of triangles that are smaller than they used to be, and a lot of triangles that are larger than they used to be. And basically what's happening is that bend stiffness wants to preserve the normals. It wants to keep a nice smooth sort of normals pointing outwards, and it doesn't want normals to rapidly change from sort of one point to its neighboring point. It's doing that by allowing the shape to compress. So if the forces are pushing these regions together, when you have high bend stiffness but low shape stiffness, it just allows these triangles to get compressed. So the individual shapes are changing, the normals are being preserved. And so you end up getting this nice smooth contour. It's almost like you have a really stiff elastic shell sitting on top of something on the interior. It's going to try to keep itself nice and smooth. In shape stiffness, we don't see any of this discoloration, or this sort of visualization coloration. And that's telling us that our shapes aren't changing at all. The areas of these triangles are basically identical to how they were coming in. What happens instead is if we're trying to push these regions together, it says, well, the only way to do that is to increase folds, because I don't want to allow these triangles to shrink or expand, so the only way to get them to sort of obey those forces is to let them fold, to let them sort of change the normals. So all of this is to say that if you want wrinkles, what you really want to do is bump up shape stiffness. Bend stiffness will give you a nice smooth contour, like a very elastic, smooth, tough shell. Shape stiffness is going to give you these nice wrinkles. So if we want wrinkles, we really want to boost shape stiffness. So let's switch that off and head back to our noise here. And so if we want high shape stiffness, then that's going to give us our wrinkles. And so by default, it's got a shape stiffness around 2000 and a bend stiffness of 0. So we'll take a look at that, but actually to get really nice wrinkles, I'm going to crank this quite high. But let's just start with this. And let's head out and take a look at our imported geometry here. Now it's going to be upset initially because we're still pointing to that solid object. We want a hybrid object. So let's just say star hybrid, and there we go. And we've got another one of our scene update issues. There we go, that's fixed this time. So now right away, you can see that we are starting to get some of these interesting sort of folds. So as we go through here, we're getting this sort of extra movement and extra interaction of that surface. So that's looking pretty good. I might even throw, because let's smooth this a little bit. I'm going to leave the smooth off actually for now because it takes time, but let's just throw a quick shade on here because we did put UVs on it. For some reason that's not updating. It does have UVs. Why is it not showing? There we go. Again, we have to update that scene view. So if we run this through, these UVs can just help us to see a little bit more of these distortions that we're getting. And you can see we're starting to get some of this sort of wrinkling appearance, but it's not nearly as much as I would like. And so what we saw before is to get really nice wrinkles, what we need to do is really crank that shape stiffness. So I'm going to go back into here, and go to my hybrid object, and I actually want to boost this quite high. I'm going to boost this up to something insane like a million. Let's do 1e6. So this is a really strong shape stiffness, but it's going to give us some really nice wrinkles. So let's just run that. Okay, and if we go back out to our geometry here, now we can see we're getting these really nice wrinkles coming through. It's really sort of puckering, and it's looking like over here we've got some really nice wrinkles going on there. Basically, whenever it sort of indents, whenever that geometry is pulling inwards, this has no choice but to kind of buckle and give these interesting ridges and folds going on here. And so if you want that nice wrinkly exterior, that's what you're going to want to do. You're going to want to make sure that you have a really high surface stiffness being applied here, or shape stiffness rather. And actually we can see it even better without those UVs on there. If we move over to smooth shaded, you can see that we do still have some of this sort of triangular patterns going through. But now if we give it a little bit of smoothing, you can see we get this sort of really nice shape here. Got some really interesting folds and grooves here. And yeah. So that's basically all I wanted to talk about in this first setup. Really just a basic introduction to this idea of our material directions and our fiber scale and how we can sort of modify this inside the simulation to sort of push and pull on our different fibers. And then of course adding skin, because that's always fun. So main takeaway there, if you want wrinkly skin, high shape stiffness. Okay, now for our second setup, instead of using noise, I want to use something a little bit more strategic or a little bit more deliberate here. I'm going to call this one periodic, and it's a secondary name, sort of Inchworm, because what we want to do is basically now use periodic functions and be a little bit more deliberate about our fiber scale to set up a kind of Inchworm style movement. So I'm going to head inside a new geometry here, and I'm just going to drop down a box. I want this to be kind of long and kind of flat, so I'm going to give it something like, I don't want it quite as tall as it is wide. I want it to basically have a very clear sort of bottom and top. And I'm going to make it a fair bit longer here, maybe along the z-axis. So here's our basic shape. I want this to be resting on the ground because it's actually going to be moving along the ground. And so that's where we'll start. I'm going to drop down a remesh here, get it nice and triangulated. I want these triangles a bit smaller. That's looking pretty good. I'm going to bump up the iterations to get them a bit more regular. That should be a decent enough start. And now I'd like this a little bit more rounded. We want to make this kind of like a little worm, so this box is not quite right. So let's just do something like a really strong smooth here. And now we've got this kind of funny capsule shape, and that'll do just fine. It's not exactly the most exciting model or anything, but it'll give us sort of what we're looking for to basically set up these dynamics. So with that taken care of, let's talk a little bit about what we want to do inside of FEM. And so I can illustrate this really easily. Basically what an inchworm does is it sort of contracts and expands over and over again. And when it contracts, it basically latches to the ground at sort of one end, folds itself up, which brings in the back end, and then it holds on with the back end and pushes out forward again. So we want it to kind of contract and relax, contract and relax. And the way we're going to do this, we can see if I just show a little demonstration here. I'm going to measure area on these primitives. I'll call this rest area. Then I'm going to drop a bend stop. Then I'm going to measure area again, and I'll call this bend area. And then we'll just drop a final wrangle here, and I'll just say area change equals bend area minus rest area. And we're going to head down here and we're going to visualize that. So just click on that attribute and we should get a visualizer here. There we go. Now on the bend stop, I just want to sort of set this up so our capture origin is at the sort of end of it. So that's going to be at 0.25 and minus 1.5 should be over here. Our capture direction is along Z and our length is 3. So now if we bend this thing, there we go. I'm not getting my visualizer. Suggests to me that we might need a new CPU. Still no visualizer. Why is that? Oh, that's right. I've done this before. Area is on primitives. Area here is on primitives. I did a point wrangle here. So bend area and rest area are on primitives. I just made these are 0, of course, so nothing is changing. I want to do this on primitives. And now, let's get our area changed. There we go. Now we can see it. And all I really wanted to show here is that when we bend, what we're doing is compressing the triangles on the inner side and expanding them on the outer side. And this makes sense if you think of this as like an arc of a circle. This circumference is going to be smaller than this circumference as we contract in. And what this tells us is that if we want to cause our shape to bend, what we can do is contract all the fibers along the bottom and expand them along the top, and that will cause it to sort of bend in. If we flip that and we expand the ones along the bottom and contract them along the top, then we'll bend in the other direction. And so we can set up a really easy sort of directional bending by using kind of a top and a bottom group and causing one to contract while the other expands. So that's what we're going to set up here. That's our ultimate aim. Let's see if we can fix this. There we go. So of course we're going to need to start by just creating our tetrahedral geometry. I'm going to use conform again, just because we do have these nice triangles. There's not too many of them. This is going to give us only 5,000 tets, so that's no big deal. So we'll take this as our basic sort of tetrahedral mesh. Then I'm going to go ahead and create a couple of groups. I want these to be point groups because we're going to be manipulating our fibers on the points. So I'm going to have a top group, and I'll just keep this in bounding regions, and let's make this matched to our original box. So I'm going to grab this size, I'm going to paste those relative references here, and I'm just going to make sure it's expanded a little bit on X and Z. So that gives this box here, but this time we want the top because I said it was the top group. So let's just shift it up, and there we go. We grab basically the top half of the points. And this doesn't have to be too exact, but this should do just fine. For the bottom, we'll do basically the same thing, but this time we're going to not shift it upwards. So we'll just leave it at 0 there, and we'll only grab the bottom ones. There we go. So now we have a top and a bottom group. That's all we really need. We'll drop an attribute wrangle and set up our fibers. And so this time, what we want is to basically contract the bottom and expand the top, or vice versa. But we want to do it along a consistent axis here. So this is a case where we're basically just going to set our material W at the beginning, and we're never going to change it again. So our long axis is the Z-axis here, and that's what we want for our fiber axis. So we'll say that our material W is just 0, 0, 1, the Z-axis. I'm going to leave our fiber scale at 1 for now. We're going to be modifying that inside in a SOP solver. And I'm going to go ahead and say our fiber stiffness. I actually want this to be pretty high, but not too crazy. Something like 20 should be fine. And this, again, we're also not going to change. So it's really just fiber scale we're going to be modifying. So that's almost all we need up here. Let's just drop our FEM geometry. I'm not going to worry about embedding geometry here because I just want to show sort of the idea of how to set up this movement and this workflow. Obviously, this funny little lozenge shape is not super interesting, so there's no real point in also bulking it out to a higher resolution version. So if you want to do that, then go ahead and do the same workflow we did last time. But I just want to focus on our basic dynamics here. So here's our FEM geometry. I'm going to drop a dot network. And this time we want a little bit more. We do want a ground plane because it's going to be moving along the ground. We want some gravity so it's simulating properly. So I'll just wire those together. Right off the bat, I'll put down a multiple solver. And then we want our solid object. Oops, that's something else. We want our solid object, our SOP solver, and our FEM solver. Wire those in here, wire this in here, and this will be our basic setup. So again, nothing too complicated, but here we go. I'm going to go to the ground plane. I'm going to take its friction down a little bit, just so this thing can kind of move around a bit. And I don't actually want to display it. Because of our scene view, this grid here is actually our current solid object. This is just geometry that shouldn't be visible. Let's see if we can get rid of it. Nope, it's stuck. Make another scene view. There we go. This is the default FEM geometry, which we don't want. So we'll just go to deformation and bring in, I'm going to collapse this guy, and bring in our periodic Inchworm geo. And there we have that. So here's what we're going to be working with. And let's go ahead and set this up in our SOP solver. So to get us started, let's just look at sort of a periodic contraction and expansion. And we'll see that it's not really going to move itself because we need something extra before that happens, but let's just see how we can get this to sort of behave in the way we might want. I'm going to drop down an attribute wrangle. I'm going to do another one of these little reinitialize steps. And all I want here is just to set fiber scale to 1. We're going to add some extra stuff in here in a bit, but for now this is enough. Now for our contraction, what we want to do is drive this based on, say, a periodic function. So we want it to sort of regularly contract and expand, kind of like the very first thing we did with that sphere earlier. So I'm going to make a variable. I'm just going to call this pulse. And I'm going to do fit 1, 1 because we're going from -1 to 1. And we're going to do sine of time. And I'm going to multiply this by maybe 3. So every 2 seconds or so it'll pulse. Now let's go up to 4. And for now I'm just going to fit this to 0 to 1. So we're just taking the range -1 to 1 and mapping it to 0 to 1. And the reason I want to do this is because I want to feed this into a ramp. And so a ramp expects 0 to 1. So we're just going to set that up right away. So this pulse variable is going to range from 0 up to 1, and then back to 0, back to 1, etc., etc. And it'll just keep looping that way. So now we can use this to drive our fiber scale. And critically, we'll do this separately for our top and our bottom. So if it's our top group, we're going to say our fiber scale equals, we're going to fit the output of a ramp. We're going to call this top ramp. We'll pass it that pulse value. So ramp is going to return a value in 0 to 1, and we're passing it a value in 0 to 1, so it basically just remaps those two into the shape that we're going to give it on the ramp. So we're going to fit that value into basically our minimum and our maximum output here. And what we want for an inchworm is we want it to sort of contract on the bottom, so it should really get, here, we want it to go really contracted on the bottom and really expanded on the top, but we don't want it to necessarily flip in the other direction. So we want it to give us like an inverted U, but we don't want it to sort of flip up in this direction. So we want its resting to be sort of like 1 on one end of our periodic function, but then contracted on the other. So for the top, that means our minimum value should be basically resting, 1, and our maximum value should be more expanded. For our bottom, our minimum value should be more contracted, less than 1, and our maximum should be 1. So for our map here, for the top, we're going to go from something like 1 to, let's say, 1.3. And then for our bottom, we're going to say our fiber scale, bit of 1, another ramp, we'll call this bottom ramp, acid pulse, and And in this case, we want to map from something lower than 1, let's say 0.65, up to 1. I'll click this little button here so we get our ramps created. And what I want to do is basically these are going to range fairly smoothly. I actually want the transition to be a little bit more abrupt. So I'm going to grab these, I'm going to make it a bit of a smoother interpolation, and then I'm going to add some steps here. And it doesn't really matter which way we do this as long as we flip it. So if we're increasing in this direction for the top, then we want to decrease for the bottom. Switch that to cubic, and I'm just going to flip these. Oops, just lost my one value. There it is. Grab this one, bring that down to 0. So now these are flipped. So when one is going up, the other will go down. That's what we want. But I also want this to be a little bit more stepped. So I'm going to add a couple extra points here. I'm going to put one at, say, 5.5, and we'll bring that all the way up to, say, 0.8. And I'll put this at 4.5 and bring it all the way down to 0.2. So just making a little bit of a step function here. I'm going to do the reverse over here. So at 4.5, we'll go to 0.8. And then at 5.5, we'll go down to 0.2. So now we'll be getting these things flipping. And so if we do this, what we should see is our initial sort of step of inching, or our inchworm. So what it should do is basically contract and then relax. And sure enough, we get our contraction, relaxes back to flat, and then it contracts again, and relaxes back to flat. So now we're getting this nice sort of initial scaffold behavior for the inchworm. But you'll see that it's not really going anywhere. It does seem to be drifting a little bit in the negative Z direction because it's not fully symmetrical. So this isn't like a perfectly symmetrical mesh here. So there's a little bit of force imbalances, and that's causing it to drift a little bit. But this isn't really what we're looking for inchworm movement. To really get it to start to locomote, what we need to do is let it grab the ground somehow. So we need the front to be able to grab while it's contracting, and then the back should grab while it relaxes. So to set this up, we're going to need some target constraints. And if we look at the solid object here, you can see this tab for target deformation. And in the most sort of classic format, how you would use this is you would have some other animated geometry that has the same topology, like the exact same set of points as your tetrahedral mesh. So you have sort of your arrest version and your animated version, and then you would use your animated version as a target or for your sort of simulated version, and it would sort of, to varying degrees of strength, try to match that. And that's how you would normally use this. You can also specify this yourself, though. You can set up individual target points for each point, and you can change the strength individually by point. So what we're going to do to grab the ground is we're going to say certain points are going to be sort of locked to their current position when we grab in space, and that will give it sort of a rigid sort of constraint at that point. So if we grab at the front, we'll basically say these points should be stuck. They should use as target point their current point. And then when we release, it'll be free to move again. So we're going to use this sort of target strength information, but we're not going to pass in an animated geometry. We're just going to update this stuff ourselves. So the one thing we need to set up out here is another few groups. And in particular, we need sort of a front and a back. So let's drop down another couple groups. I'm going to call this one front. Again, it should be points. And I'm going to use a bounding region here again. I'll just grab this and move this by hand. Make sure it's wide enough to get everything. Bring it up. And I'm going to leave this in a sort of problematic place to begin with, and then we'll talk about this in a moment. But I'm going to put it something like there. We're just going to grab a good chunk of the front, and we'll do something very similar for the back. There's our back, and for the back, we just want to move it to the back. And that's looking fine there. So now we have a front group and a back group. If we go back inside of DOPS, what we want to do now is specify when should the front grab and when should the back grab. And there's a few ways we can do this, but the main way to think about this is when we're contracting, we want to grab with the front, and when we're relaxing, we want to grab with the back. And so the way to think about contracting and relaxing is basically based on this, this pulse value, which is going, scroll up here, oops, scroll up, there we go. This pulse attribute that we specify here is going from 0 to 1, and then back to 0, and then back to 1, and then back to 0. So this is giving us a sense of what's happening. And in particular, when it's contracting, that's when our pulse is increasing. That's when we're going from 0 up to 1. So that's where we are increasing the top and decreasing the bottom. So if our current pulse is higher than our previous pulse, that means we're contracting. If it's lower, that means we're going in this direction. We're going back down. That means that our bottom is relaxing, and our our bottom is relaxing and our top is relaxing. So basically, when pulse is increasing, that means we're contracting, and when it's decreasing, that means we're relaxing. So all we need to figure that out is to actually just store our previous pulse. So let's do that up here. Let's say prev pulse equals pulse. So before we calculate our new one, we'll just store our old one. And on the first frame, this will just be 0, and that's fine. Let's drop another attribute wrangle, and we'll call this grab logic. And so what we want to do here is basically just test for the front and the back group whether or not they're in those different periods. So we'll say if we are in the front group, then if pulse is greater than our previous pulse, we have grab potential. And I'm just going to go ahead and set our target strength value, which is our multiplier on sort of how strongly it should try to reach its target position. We haven't set a lot of that up yet, but the basic idea is that we'll set target strength to 1 here. And we'll do the opposite for the back. So if we're in the back group, then we want to check if pulse is less than our previous pulse. And in that case, we have the potential to grab, and I'll just set target strength to 1. So now we always have our target strength being sort of set to 1. We're never setting it to 0 anywhere, though. So let's go to our reinitialization here, and let's just make sure we reinitialize that value. So we'll say target strength should be 0. And I'm even going to go out here and make sure that our target strength is set to 0 at the beginning. So we want to make sure that only the points that are currently grabbing get any target strength. Everything else should not be paying any attention to its target positions. And speaking of target positions, what we're going to do for that, at the outset, we can just go ahead and say our target position is our resting position. Because the strength is 0, this doesn't really matter. We're just giving it a value that kind of makes sense. What we're going to do inside the solver is at every step, we're going to reset our target position to our current position. This means that as soon as we grab, we're basically locking ourselves to the position that these points are already at. So we don't want it to grab to its sort of resting position. Here, we want it to grab wherever it currently is. And so at every step, we just update the target position. And if it's already locked, then it won't really move much. It'll stay wherever it grabbed. And if it's free to move, then this will continue to move, and we'll keep updating our target position. Now with this in place, if we go ahead and run it, we still won't see anything. And the reason is we've set up sort of our target strength on the points, but that's actually a multiplier on the overall target strength on the object. And so even though we're not specifying an external target deformation, we still set our overall strength here. And so we want to update this value, and I'm going to make this quite large. I know from experience that about whatever this even ends up being, what is that, 2 billion, I guess? At about this value, we get sort of a nice behavior here. And you can see this target damping value updates on its own. This is actually going to be a problem. I'll just sort of show you here. So, you know, it's behaving very strangely here, and we're seeing some weird things, but one of the main things that you're seeing is it's actually starting to float off of the ground here. And it seems like it's not really even sort of updating in the way it was before. We're getting this really kind of strange behavior going on. And what target damping is doing is it's basically trying to kind of resist overly quick accelerations and snapping to targets. And in practice, what it seems to do, I'm not 100% sure because you can't open this solver. There's nothing to see. You can't really unpack this, so I don't have a real sense of how it's using this value. But in practice, what it seems to be doing is basically smoothing these target forces. And so even though target strength on the points is set to 0 for like almost everything in here, it's still using those target values to try to sort of update things. And it creates this really weird dynamic across the whole structure. And the way to solve this is to just set our damping all the way down to 0. We basically don't want any at all. We want these handful of points that we are actually grabbing with to have the full strength right away, and we want nothing else to have any strength at all. So if we do this, let's just step out to here. I only want to see that one object, and I actually want to visualize our target strength. So I'll throw that on there. And now if we step forward, you can see that right away at the first frame, our front group is grabbing, and now you can see the back group is sort of pulling towards it. And then as soon as it releases, I'm not sure why it stopped grabbing there. So it grabbed, and then it let go a little early. Why is that happening? Let's just see what we're doing here. Target strength. There we go. I said target strength, which is not a thing. We want target strength. There we go. Okay, so if we head back out here, now we should see this alternating. Grabs at the front, grabs at the back. However, it's still not quite working right. And there's a few reasons for this. One of the biggest ones right now is that when we grab at the front here, we're not really letting it contract very well. And part of the reason is that we're grabbing along this bottom surface here. And in fact, we're grabbing all of these individual points. And they're grabbing wherever they are in space. And that means these are locking a lot of this orientation, and they're really constraining the ability of any of this to move. And there's two things I want to do here. First of all, there's no reason the top should be grabbing. If we think of this as actually a physical system that's grabbing the ground at the front, it should only be able to grab where it's in contact here. So we want to add something a little bit extra into our code. In particular, when I commented grab potential, what I mean here is that while this condition is active, while pulse is greater than previous pulse, that means we should be able to grab with the front, but we still only want to grab with those points that are near to the ground. And so we can test that. So we actually want an extra condition here. We just want to say, is our P at Y less than some grab threshold? Let's call that grab thresh. And in that case, we'll set our target strength to 1. We'll do the same thing here. And then just update. And now we want a grab threshold, and we want it sort of reasonably small. Let's say something like 0.1. And so you can see only those points that are near the ground are actually going to grab. So that'll get us part of the way there. Let's just take a look at this now. Now it's working a little bit better. You can see it's sort of pulling up at the back. It's struggling to move forward at the front there. And part of the problem that's still going on here, when we grab at the front, let's just get to some point where we've grabbed, we're still grabbing along this whole bottom surface here. And what this is doing is in the same way that when the whole thing was active here, it was sort of restricting the ability of the nearby stuff to move. By grabbing along this whole bottom surface here with a lot of these sort of oriented along the ground parts, what we're doing is constraining the ability of this stuff to bend. And so for our front group, we really want to make sure it's restricted to like the very front end. We want it to be able to grab on like this surface here, but we don't want it really grabbing on the bottom, because when it does that, the rest of the structure can't bend around it, and we restrict our ability to move. So let's go back to our front group here. And you can see we're selecting a lot of these sort of bottom surface. I want to pull this really far forward here. I want to basically move it so that we're only really getting that tip there. And this means it'll actually contract in a little bit before it grabs, but that's totally okay. The back group, this is a lot less important because of how it's going to move and how it's going to push. We don't really mind it grabbing as much, but I might even pull this back a little as well. I don't want lots of points grabbing, I just want these little focal areas. So now if we try this, you can see right away it's pulling itself a lot farther forward. And that's because it's only grabbing on this part here. And that's allowing it to hinge a lot better than it did before. So you can see it's actually sort of rotating around to that point. When we had that much larger surface, it wasn't really able to do that. And so now, fingers crossed, we're getting a little bit of this movement coming through. It's not moving very quickly, and part of that is it's not really getting much push from the back. It's not relaxing quite fast enough, although it's doing all right, but it's sort of just falling down. Like it's restricting how much it moves a little bit, but we're not getting much forward push from that backstroke, and we're actually sort of falling backwards a little bit. So let's see what we can do to fix this. But you can see that it's moving. It's not moving quickly, but it is moving forward. It's sort of steadily making that forward progress in that kind of inchworm way. But let's see if we can make this a little bit better. And one thing we might look at is our stiffness. So if we look at our object here, we've got a shape stiffness of 40 and a volume stiffness of 100. I think what I want to do is let its shape stiffness get a little bit higher. That should make it a bit more rigid. That should again resist deformation of these triangles. And that means when it's sort of pushing, when it's sort of up in this point, you can see what it's doing right now is it's sort of letting a lot of these triangles kind of compress and stretch. If we up this stiffness a little bit, then it might actually be able to generate a bit more force through these links, so that when it's kind of relaxing, it might actually push this out a little bit farther. So let's bring up our shape stiffness to maybe 100 or so. And if we take a look now, it brings itself up quite far actually, and then there we go. It really pushes it, actually kind of launches itself a little bit. And so that's looking much better. Great. It's got a little asymmetry. It's kind of going off to the side a bit here. But this is good enough for sort of showing you what we're looking for on this setup. If you wanted to restrict a little bit of that sideways motion, you would basically just have to control the model a little bit better. You might even basically give it some steering, and you could totally do that by adding left and right contraction and doing a similar logic there. You could actually steer this little blob here. But basically I just wanted to show this simple inchworming setup because it's a nice example of basically getting a regular motion and getting some self-locomotion using basically just a periodic function and a tiny bit of logic. So we don't need any keyframes or anything like that, and we get this nice sort of inchworming motion. Okay, now for our last setup, I want to do something a little bit more complicated. We're going to sort of build out this inchworm idea, but we're going to make something that's more reactive. So instead of driving ourselves with like a noise or with a periodic function, we're going to drive with math and sort of responsiveness to another target geometry. So let's just drop down a wrinkle, or a wrinkle geometry here. I'm going to call this one, let's say, Reactive, anemone. So we're going to make something like a little sort of deep sea anemone. So I'm going to head in here, and let's start with some geometry. I'm going to start with a sphere, as before. I'll make this a polygon. The size doesn't matter too much. We're going to be adjusting a few parts of this. But let's just say, let's get our frequency up a little bit, maybe to 10 or so. That's looking pretty good. Now, I actually only want this upper hemisphere. And so we'll just do a polyfill. Where are we? Polyfill. And a single polygon spine. We're going to be remeshing all of this and everything. So this is going to be kind of the base. Now, onto this thing, I'd like to add, I'd like to scatter and add a bunch of little tentacles. So let's go ahead and put some normals on here. I'm just going to add point normals. I just want to make sure they get sort of attached to any points I scatter. And then I'm going to scatter. And before I do this, I basically don't want any right at the ground here. I'm going to want to be able to sort of adjust this. So let's go ahead and drop down another attribute wrinkle. I'm just going to use a density expression here. So I'm going to say density is 1, but if p.y is less than, I don't know, let's say 0.2, our density will be 0. Now we can go here and use a density attribute, and you'll see it won't scatter any along the bottom there. Now 1,000 is still going to be way too many. We want something like maybe 8 or so. Okay, So onto these points, we want to attach basically some tentacles. So I'm going to start with a line, and I'm going to orient this along Z. So when you copy something to a point and it has a normal, that's basically going to be facing along Z. So I'm going to orient this along Z. Like the 2 is fine. So if we were to just copy these to the points, looks like we're not getting our normal here. Why is that? Oh, I turned it off. I meant to put that on points. There we go. So now we've got these pointed outwards from that sphere here. So these are going to be kind of the scaffold for our tentacles. I'd like to do a few extra things. I'd like them to vary a little bit in their length, and we can do that pretty easily. I'll just throw down an attribute randomize. Actually, is this the one I want? This is what I want, yeah. And we're going to call this scale. Should be 3-dimensional. And basically, I just want to randomize the z-axis. So I'm going to make sure x and y aren't changing at all. But z, we're not going to modify very much, but let's range from like 0.8 to 1.2. So we do that. Some of them are going to be a little bit longer. Some of them will be a little bit shorter. Just get a little bit of variation there. Okay. Now, we don't actually just want a line here. We want this to be sort of a geometry. So let's just look at a single line here. I'm going to first resample this. Get a lot more sort of intervals on here. I might even do more than that. Doesn't really matter. Let's just go crazy with it. We're going to be remeshing all of this anyway. And I'm going to add a curve U on here. I'm going to take this and I'm going to use it to drive p-scale. So we're going to say our p-scale is going to be fit01. We'll take a ramp, and we'll call this scale ramp, and we're going to pass it curve U. So when you specify curve U, it basically just gives you an attribute that ranges from 0 at one end to 1 at the other. It's a nice feature of resample. So we're using that, and we're basically going to scale. We're going to set a ramp for this value. And so we'll be able to basically just kind of visually adjust what size this will be from end to end. And we'll fit this from sort of a maximum size, which we'll maybe just call, well, we'll adjust all of these. Let's say 0.5 to 0.05. Throw this down, we'll get a ramp. We'll adjust that in a second. And the last thing I want to do is just drop a polywire. And on here, I'm going to use p-scale for the width. And so now we get this shape, and it's kind of tapering down based on this ramp that we have here. So if we throw this into our geometry to copy into our points, and then, just for the sake of seeing it all together, visualize here, we're starting to get this kind of an appearance. Obviously this isn't looking too great, but it's getting us in the right direction here. So obviously we're going to want to change our sort of maximum and minimum widths here. Our maximum is probably a little bit too high. So let's drop that to maybe 0.3. That's looking a little bit better. We're going to want a lot more divisions on here. Get it a little bit rounder. 8's not bad, but we can go up to say 12. That's looking okay. And now I'd like to adjust kind of this shape so it's not just this perfect tapering here. I'm going to grab these. I'm going to make them a little bit smoother. I like monotone cubic. And let's just sort of taper it a bit. I've got this like inverted from how I want it. That's all right. We could invert, but this is fine. Okay, so we want to range from our maximum at one end to our minimum at the other. And no, I do want to invert this. This is just going to bother me a little bit, so I'm going to go from. I'm just going to flip these values so we go from our minimum to our maximum. It just feels a little bit more intuitive to me. There we go. And now we can adjust this a little bit more directly how we want. So I think I'd like it to sort of taper a bit. Maybe something like this. And maybe let's switch these to a spline. I think that might look a little bit better. There we go. Okay, now we're starting to get somewhere. I think that's the sort of shape I want. I want a little bit of this curve going up in there. And I might even want the tips to be a little bit narrower. Let's go to maybe 0.04. Even narrower. 0.02. Too narrow. There we go. Factor of 10. All right. So that's looking pretty good. The next thing I want to deal with is this fact that we're basically sitting on top of the sphere here. And we can deal with that pretty easily. What I want to do after this scatter is basically just take these points that we're going to be copying to, and I'm just going to shift them kind of inside that sphere a little bit. So we'll just say at p minus equals our normal times some small value, let's say 0.1. And so now you can see that these things are sort of recessed on the interior here. And we can even potentially bring this up a little bit. We don't want to go too far. We want to go sort of just as far as we need to. And that is looking pretty good. If we look at one of these, we can see it's not kind of popping out anywhere on those edges. It's sitting entirely on the interior here. And that's perfect. These tentacles overall are seeming actually a little bit short, so maybe what I'll do is bump up the length of this line to something like 2. And that's looking a lot better to me. And we can even just scatter a few more on here. Let's go up to 10. I'm still getting a bunch of these around the bottom that are pointed sort of straight to the side. I think I'd rather them all be angled up a little bit more. So let's go to this threshold here and maybe move that up a bit to 0.3. It's looking a little bit better. Let's even try 0.35. And that's looking pretty good to me. They're all basically angled upwards, but we're still getting a nice mix of them. So this is roughly what our base shape is going to look like. Okay. Now, what we need to do at this point is instead of merging, I want to make this into a single geometry. I'm going to do a Boolean union. That's going to give me these. And then at this point, I'd like to go ahead and remesh, and then I kind of want to smooth some of this, because if we were to look at this with its regular shading, we have these really obvious joints here. So I think I want to smooth out a little bit of this. And what I want to do is basically make sure we only smooth nearby to sort of this interior. I don't really want to smooth out towards the ends of these. And we can do that by setting up a kind of weighting function. So let's go on to our Boolean here, and let's actually output our seams. And I want to output basically all of our seams. So I want to make sure I get seams between individual tentacles. I'm not sure if we have any in this particular geometry, but we might if we sort of randomize some other parameters. This one looks like it might be. So I'm going to output basically all of our seams. But I'm just going to call them all seams. If I promote this, I'm going to take, oh, that's a group. If I do a group promote, I can take seams and bring them up to points. Now we can see here are all the points that have been promoted there, so these are all of our seam points. And what I want to do is basically set up a weighting that is high near the seam and low pretty much everywhere else. And we can do this with distance from geometry. And so I'm just going to take the geometry I want the attribute to be on. We're going to apply this to everything. We don't need to specify anything here. And that geometry, I basically want to see how far away are we from this seam group. So I'm just going to pipe the same geometry in here, but I'm going to use the group seams. And that group is a point group. And so now we should be able to get this distance attribute. If we just visualize this, sure enough, we get the distance from those seams. And so it's very low here and very high up here. I'm going to take that distance value, and I'm going to remap it to smooth. I'm going to say at smooth W is going to be, let's just fit this distance from maybe 0 to 2.3, and we'll have a weight from 1 to 0. We visualize this. That's maybe a little too localized. Let's go up to, say, 0.5. And that's giving sort of a nice range that's fairly restricted to these areas. So now we can go in and do an actual blur. And we can specify that smooth W here. So we have our smooth weight. We're blurring P. I'm going to up the step size fully. And I'm going to really just get a bunch of blurs in there. And that's entirely too many. I think I want to expand this a little bit farther. This is still giving me trouble. We would go all the way out to 2. This is blurring too much. So back to maybe 3. And part of the issue here actually is that we don't have a fairly consistent geometry, so let's just go to these for a second. And even on the polywire, let's maybe remesh these. So that's obviously too coarse. We'll bring that down. Really nice and high detail. This is just gonna, again, we're gonna remesh before we go into the simulation, so I'm not too worried about having too many polygons here. I really want a lot to work with when I'm setting up the initial. So in fact, let's go ahead and bump up this original sphere. Okay, so that's looking a little bit nicer, and now if we go to our blur, everything else should propagate, and yeah, that's a lot more friendly. It's not going to sort of pull in the same way it was before. Bring a few of these up. And maybe we can let this sort of taper off so that it's never quite fully 0. Well, maybe I don't like that. Okay, that's probably looking all right. Let's bring this back down to 5 or so. There we go. So that's looking a little bit better. We just have these nice, much smoother sort of boundaries here. It doesn't look like they've been grafted on quite as much. This is all a little bit besides the point for this tutorial, but I did want to just kind of smooth that out a little bit. Okay. Now basically what I want to do here is I want to have each of these tentacles be able to react to some other geometry. So I'm basically going to have like maybe a little point drifting around through here, and I want each of these tentacles independently to kind of reach towards it. And so basically when there's a point like here, for example, I want this tentacle to basically contract on the near side and expand on the far side. And if we apply this to all the tentacles, they'll all basically sort of reach and follow and try to sort of grab towards any moving object we have here. So for this to work, we need a few things. We need to make sure we have sort of groups that are telling us when we're a tentacle and when we're sort of the middle part. And we want to understand, basically for every point, where we're facing relative to that original tentacle. So to do this, I actually want to go back to this tentacle, and I want to keep this original line, because this is going to be really useful. This geometry is kind of what it's going to look like, but I want to keep this original line because it tells us sort of all the information we need. This gives us like the axis. So I'm going to call this group axis, and I'm just going to merge this in with the rest of the geometry here. And so now the output of this copied at points actually has those lines in it. If I split them out, if I just say give me the axis, now I have each of my tentacle axes. I'm also going to go in here, maybe on this one, and let's just say I'll say TTCL for tentacle is our point none. And so now we should have a different value for each of our tentacles here. I'm going to promote that value up to primitives. And so now we have a line for each tentacle, and we have its sort of number. So we can individually identify each of our tentacles, and we sort of have their specific axis down the middle that we can reference and sort of pay attention to really easily. So now let's go back to our overall shape here, and we want to turn this into our tetrahedral mesh. So I'm just going to go ahead and say solid embed. I'm going to stop this because it's going to do a lot of work because we have really small triangles. I'm just going to go to manual for a second here. On the solid embed, I'm going to switch this local scaling to constant, and this is going to let me basically specify roughly what size triangles do I want. So if we do that with 1, we're not really getting, we're getting an okay representation actually, but it's not quite good enough. This is only 3,000 tets. I want to keep myself in around a 10 to 15,000 tet budget. That should simulate reasonably quickly. So we still have some space for that. I'm just going to keep an eye on our sort of base mesh underneath and look at our tet mesh on top. So I'm just going to scale this down a little bit. Let's try 0.5. Didn't make much difference. Let's go all the way down to maybe 0.1. Starting to get a little bit smaller, but we're still only looking at about 3,000 tets. Let's keep dropping this down until we start to see something we like. Well, that's looking a little bit better. Now we're getting these nice regular tetrahedrons. We have reasonably full encapsulation. There's a few spots like here where this stuff is sticking out, but that's still okay even for our embedding. And we have about 12,000 tetrahedrons, so that's not bad at all. And if we clip this, what I really want to see, I'm going to keep them below the plane. What I want to see is that we at least have some points on the interior of these tentacles. And right now we still don't have a lot, but it's probably okay. We are getting a few in here. I think this will be fine. These are relatively thin tentacles, but as long as we have our surface points, we should still be able to drive our dynamics okay. Okay, so this is our basic tet mesh. Now we want to assign some groups on here because we want to control these different points in different ways depending on where they are. So the first thing I want to do is just set up a base, and I want a core region as well. And so for that, I'm going to take this original shape. I'm going to convert this to polygons. So I'm going to do a VDB from polygons, or sorry, I'm going to convert it to a volume rather. 0.1 is pretty good. I'll even drop it lower, just why not? So that's looking all right. And what I want is a relatively large version of this. So I'm going to do a VDB reshape. I'm going to dilate, and that's basically just going to expand it outwards. Let me bring this back. There we go. And I might even go by about 2. I pretty much want to exclude the bases of these tentacles as well. I don't want them trying to sort of stretch right at the base, so I want to keep all of this as like my base part. So that's looking pretty good for that. I also want to contract it a little bit and set up a core region. So for this, I'm going to erode, and I'm going to sort of keep bringing that down. I want to erode quite a lot. But I want it to go right down to the ground here. So what I might do is take this original sphere instead of the clipped one. And we'll just put that in here. And there we go. Okay, that's going to be good. I'm just going to keep pulling this down. 6, maybe 8. I think that's looking pretty good. And what I basically want to do is I want to have this core region have a target. So this is going to be locked to the ground. So everything inside here is going to have a target. It's going to be sort of restricted to that spot. This outer region that's still in here, this is just going to be the base, and this is just going to simulate freely. It's not going to be sort of updated. It won't have any fibers. It won't have any targets. This will basically be locked to the middle by that core region, and it'll be sort of moved around a little bit by the tentacles doing their own thing, but otherwise this will just be like the base region. Okay, so using those, let's set up some groups here. Drop an attribute wrangle, and let's just flip these around. So this is our core, and this is our outer. So let's just drop those in there. And these are sort of surface distance representations as volumes. So basically we can sample each point and say, are you inside or are you outside of that volume? And if it's inside, then the sample will be negative, and if it's outside, it will be positive. So we can just ask if volume sample, sampling the volume called surface, because if we look at this geometry here, this primitive is surface, so that's what this volume is called by default for these VDBs. So if we sample that at the position of this point, and it is less than 0, then we're inside that region. So we can say group core is 1. And we'll do the same thing for our second input there. if that's less than 0, we say group base. And so, you know, we can just take a look at these. So we can say, let's color our base here, make it yellow, so you can see that that's highlighting all of these regions. And if we go ahead and color our core, make that, I don't know, blue, you can see that we're getting our core identified and we're getting our base identified here. And if we were to click through, you can see that that core is throughout the middle here, and then sort of it turns into the base, and then the base turns into these tentacles. So that's perfect. So basically, everything outside of the base is in the tentacle group. And in fact, maybe what we'll do, we'll leave this one, but we'll actually even put that explicitly. We'll say otherwise. So for this second sample, so this one is just for the core. For the second sample, we're either the group or we're the tentacles. There we go. And now if we were to go here, and instead of coloring that stuff, let's just make sure that this group looks okay. If we color the tentacles, I'm not selecting anything. If we color the tentacles, yeah, we just get those regions. Okay, so that's perfect. Now with these groups established, let's call this basic groups. The next thing I want to do is pull over some information from these axes, specifically for the tentacle group. So let's go over here, and I'm just going to call this, let's only work on the tentacles now that we've specified that group. I'm going to call this tentacle properties, and we're going to need all of this axis information. So what I'd like to do here is get a few things. I want to get a tentacle index, so we know uniquely each tentacle. I want to get the main direction / axis. This is going to be our material W, so we want to know the direction of each tentacle. And I also want a radial direction from the middle of each tentacle. And we'll see how we'll use this later, but this is going to be really important. So we can get most of this information pretty easily. I'm going to specify a primitive and a vector, UVW. I just want those values because now I'm going to use XYZ dist, which is basically going to find the closest point on this geometry. So even though these lines only have 2 points each, if we look here, XYZ dist won't look for the nearest point, like if we did near points, it'll just find the nearest spot anywhere on this geometry. So for each point, we're going to find the nearest spot on that geometry, stream 1, to our position. And these values, PRM and UVW I'm passing in here, these are actually being treated as addresses. And what that means is that I'm not taking a return value out front. I could be distance equals that. I actually don't care about the distance itself. What I care about is where it hit this primitive. And so what these values do is they'll actually be returned with new values. So I didn't initialize anything here, but XYZ dist will put information on these values, and it'll tell me what primitive it hit, and it'll tell me the primitive UV where it hit it. And so those are the pieces of information I want. So I'm going to just actually, I'm going to move this up. And for the tentacle index, this is just going to be, I'm going to say I at TTCL equals prim from stream 1, that value TTCL at this primitive that we intersected. So if we go here now, and if we just add, for example, a visualizer to these tentacles, we should see, there we go. We should see that we get sort of a unique value for each of these. And you'll see that this one here is the same value as the base, and that's because the base is getting a value of 0 because it's not specified. So let's just go ahead and set that. We'll initialize it to -1. So now each of our tentacles is getting a unique ID, and that's perfect, and it's separate from the base, which is just saying it's not any tentacle at all. So that's great. We're getting each of those independent tentacles. Next, what we want is the main direction of that tentacle. and that's reasonably easy. So we're just going to go position 0. It's going to be a point. And we're going to grab it from that stream. We're going to grab the position attribute, and we're going to use as a point, prim point, from the prim PRM, the first point. Because we know that each of these primitives only has 2 points. These are just the lines that we made up here. So we know they only have 2 points. We don't really have to worry about anything else there. So I'm just going to get the first one of those, specify that that's an integer because we're using it inside a function here. So we're just going to get the position of that first point. And then we'll get the position of the second point. And now we can say our material W, so the direction that our fibers should contract, which should be along the axis of each tentacle. Oops, not specified anything there. But that material W should just be normalized position 1 minus position 0. And the direction doesn't actually matter, but these will be pointed outwards. And we can see that if I get rid of everything except for the points here for a second, and then add a visualizer on material W, you'll see we get these lines pointed outwards everywhere. So each tentacle is getting its own axis, and we can see that all the points inside that tentacle know what direction they should be facing. So now we're almost done with these attributes. The last thing I want is to figure out for each point, relative to the axis, where is it facing? So if I were to sort of cut into one of these things, I want to see radially pointing outwards for each point, what direction is it away from the axis? And this is going to be really important for later for figuring out which direction it should contract or expand. So to get this value, what I want to find out is where was the position that was nearest. So this XYZ dist, it found the nearest position. That's specified by the primitive and this UVW. I want to find that position. So I'm going to call that axis pose, and we can get that using a function called primUV. And this will basically let me ask for the value P, so the position value on this primitive, at this primitive UV. So this isn't a texture UV, this is a primitive UV. And it basically specifies coordinates in the context of this primitive. So this is going to tell me what's the position where I found that nearest distance. So that's my axis position. Now if I want my radial direction, well, that's super easy. I already know that that this position minus, or sorry, my individual points position minus this position is already going to be orthogonal to the axis. It has to be. That's what it means by this being the nearest point. Because we're taking the nearest point to a line, we know that it's already going to be orthogonal, which is what we want. So if we just take the subtraction, it's going to give us that radial distance, or that radial direction, rather. So I'm just going to say V at radial is going to be, I'm going to normalize this, it's going to be our current position minus the axis position. Axis position. And that's normalized, so now if we visualize these, you can see, and I'm just going to turn off the material W1, you can see now for each point it's basically pointing radially outwards. It's telling us what direction is this. And this is kind of like a normal, so we could potentially do this with normals, but the problem is we have points on the interior as well, and those don't have sort of defined normals. So doing it this way, we basically get a point for every, or sorry, a direction for every point that tells it radially where is it going relative to this tentacle's axis. So now we've got all the values that we need to be able to sort of start making something interesting happen here. And the basic idea is going to be, we want, when there's a point somewhere in space, we want that side of the tentacle that's facing towards that point to contract, and the side that's on the far side should expand. So we're going to use that same Inchworm logic, but we're going to have it reactive to something else. So I'm just going to show you how this is going to work. Let's just add a point here. I'm going to make a little, whoops, that's a solver, that's not what I want. I'm going to make a little sphere here so we can just see this point a little bit more easily. There's that sphere. I do want to keep this. Keep toggling the wrong parts. There we go. So that sphere is somewhere in there. Let's just move this point a bit. We'll bring it up and over somewhere around here. And this is just for sort of demonstration's sake. So if we've got this point here, we want to figure out which surfaces are facing. And what it means for a surface to be facing is basically that its outwards direction from its axis should be aligned towards its vector towards this point. And so we can actually test this pretty easily. And we're going to be doing this inside DOPS, but I just want to sort of show you out here what we're about to be doing. So basically all I want to do is say, for each point, I want to get that position from this point. We only have one, so I'm just going to do 0. If we had multiple, we would just use near point, but I'm just going to grab that initial point. So that's my, I'll call this target position, and then we can define the vector toward. It's going to be normalized target position minus our current position. So this will give us a vector pointed towards that circle. Now what I want to do is say, let's get the dot product. And the dot product, I'll just show you once we've calculated it, but let's take the dot product of our radial onto that toward vector. And if I visualize this, let me get rid of those radials. Here we go, we're visualizing dot product. So when I visualize this, what you can see is that all of the surfaces facing this circle are one color, and all of the surfaces facing away are another color. And what dot product does is it basically says it ranges from -1 to 1, and it's 1 if the two vectors are in the same direction, and it's -1 if they're opposite directions, and it's 0 if they're sort of orthogonal to each other. And so what we're doing is we're taking the vector from a given point to the target, and we're taking its radial vector relative to its axis. And if they're pointing in the same direction, then this is the side that's facing towards this point. And if they're pointing the opposite, it's the opposite side. And so in our solver, all we have to do is take this dot product and use it to drive our contraction. So if we're on the inner face that's facing towards, we want to contract, and on the outer face, we want to expand. And that's pretty much all that we need to do here. So if we take this point and drag it around, you'll see that this updates really easily. It's getting a very, very simple computation. The dot product is not a difficult thing to do, but you can see that it's nicely reflecting at any given moment for each sort of tentacle which part is facing. And that's what we want. So let's leave this point here, and let's just call this our target. We'll make this a little bit fancier in a minute, but let's just leave that for now. And then we will go to our tentacle properties here. The last thing I want in here is some basic fiber properties. So let's go ahead and say our fiber stiffness is going to be 10 times normal, and we'll keep our fiber scale at 1. And actually, let's set this up in a separate thing because we want to make sure that everything isn't defaulting its fiber scale to 0. So let's just go fiber properties, and we're going to say fiber scale is 1, and fiber stiffness will also be 1, just so by default nothing is going to be moving. We're going to say if we're the tentacle group, then our fiber stiffness is going to be 10. And in fact, let's just initialize a few other properties here. Let's set our target position to be our current position, but by default, we'll say that our target strength is 0. And only if we're in that group core should our target strength be higher, something like 1. So that should give us all the properties we need, And at this point, I think we are ready to go into the dot network. And in fact, we're just about done. Really, all of the difficulty was in getting all this stuff set up. At this point, we're pretty much ready, and everything should just work. So we'll drop our FEM geometry here, and then we'll go into our dot network. I'm going to add a ground plane, even though we don't really need to collide against it. I'll just keep it in here. We do want some gravity. I'm going to drop it down, though, because I like the idea that we're sort of underwater here. I'll just merge these together. I don't want to see the ground plane. And then I'll drop, as before, a multi-solver, solid object, SOP solver, and a FEM solver. Wire those in, wire this in here, and let's start setting things up. So I want to grab this one, but our reactive one. I want to grab our FEM geometry here. There it is. I'm going to go ahead and say our target strength should be pretty high. Let's just say 1e10 like before. I'm going to get rid of this damping. I just want that inner core region to be attracted to its target, so nothing else should be updated there. And we'll see if we want to change any of these model parameters. For right now, I think this should be okay. So if we were to run this, we'll see that all our tentacles are kind of falling down. They're basically getting sort of drawn by gravity a little bit too much. So maybe we'll bring up this stiffness a little bit more, and maybe we'll even drop gravity down a little bit more. Again, I want this to seem sort of underwater. So now at resting, it's still sort of drooping, but I think this is pretty much okay. You can see already the ones that sort of first bounced are kind of rebounding to where they were before. So that's nice. We get a little bit of reactivity to gravity, but mostly it's just sort of sitting roughly at rest. So now let's pull in our target. We'll do that in the SOP solver. We'll start by reinitializing. So I'm just going to go to our, I have two groups here, tentacle and tentacles. All right, let's just fix that. Let's figure out where I did that. Here we go. So that group never existed, so let's just make sure all of this was tentacles plural. Yeah, so that was the group that I made here, was tentacles plural. Because I sort of asked about tentacle without it, it just created that group. But we want to make sure that's not there. Okay. There we go. So just for the tentacles group, we're going to start, and we're just going to say fiber scale is 1. So we'll just reinitialize that. And then we want to bring in our target. That's this null here. And we're just going to grab this function. So we'll do an attribute wrangle. And we'll just drop this right in here. Oops. And again, we only want this operating over the tentacles. And so we're going to get that target position from this stream. We're going to get the vector towards it, and we're going to take our dot product. We don't need to store this as an attribute, though, so let's just keep it locally. And now all we want to do is say our fiber scale is going to be fit 1, 1, because we're fitting in the range from -1 to 1. That's what dot product will give us. So we're going to fit that value. And at -1, we're facing away, so we want to expand. So let's call this 1.5. And at 1, we're facing towards, so we want to contract. We'll call that 0.5. And that is basically all that we need to do. So now if we run this, what we should see is all of these tentacles reaching and grabbing towards that one spot. In fact, they're going a little bit crazy about it, but that's kind of fun. They're really sort of looping in over each other. We can see a few problems here. We can see that they're all colliding with each other. So that's no good. That means that they're probably moving a little bit too quickly. We can double check that we have our collisions on. Here's a problem. So right now it's not colliding with connected components. Although we are colliding within the object. So this should be able to collide with itself. Let's just make sure. I'll attach these connected components. Yeah, so by default it wasn't letting itself collide with anything that was part of the same object. And so now we're making sure that it can collide with itself. If you're still getting collisions, the easiest way to deal with that is just up your substeps, and that should be familiar from just about any solver. If things are starting to interpenetrate, it probably means they're trying to update too far in one step, and they're missing the normal collision tests. So if you just up the substeps, it'll go a little bit more slowly, and it'll resolve a bit more easily. So right now, this thing's a little intense with its grabbing here. It's kind of fun. We're getting some interesting effects in here, but I think that's maybe a little bit too extreme. So let's go ahead and kind of change these numbers a bit. Maybe this was too much. Let's go to, say, 1.3 and 0.65. And now they're still reaching quite a lot, but it's not quite so crazy as before. Okay. So that's pretty cool. And in fact, if we came back out here and grab just our solid object here, you can see that sure enough, they're all grabbing towards the position of this object here. And so now what we can do is animate this position. And I'm going to do this in a really trivial way, just for the sake of demonstration here. I'm going to take this point, so let's just put it back at 0, and let's get it a reasonable height. 1.8 is probably fine. So we'll start in the middle here, and then we are just going to use a few sort of periodic functions here. So let's say sine $ff. Out here in translate, this expects the sine function here expects degrees. In vex, it expects radians. I don't really know why it's set up that way, but that's fine, I guess, because our rotate context here also expects degrees. So when you're in the transform node, when you're using sine in these expressions, it expects degrees, not radians. So if we just do frames, we're not even get a full resolution or revolution in this period. So let's just get this a little bit faster. Let's go like 7 maybe, and that's going to go from -1 to 1. That should be okay for a range. We'll do something similar here. I'm just going to give it a slightly different value. I want this to basically be sort of oscillating irregularly. And then on y, let's give it its own sort of oscillation, but let's make sure that we multiply this by a much smaller value. I don't want to range in ±1. I want it sort of in a relatively small range, maybe something like this. So if we just take a look at this thing here, see what it's doing, you can see it's sort of wobbling around, and this is kind of all that I want, just to be able to show how these tentacles will respond to it. So I think that's looking fine. So now, if we go back and run our simulation again, I'm actually going to merge these together just so we can see it all at once. We'll give our target a little bit of color so it pops out. And now, we're getting some weird scene update. Let's just see if we can fix that here. There we go. So now, you can see that these tentacles are all reaching towards it, and as it moves past, they start to shift and they start to reach towards its new location here. And so, as this target moves around, each of these tentacles is continuously trying to figure out where is this ball relative to the direction that radial position is facing. And the tentacle will try to contract towards it and expand on the far side. So we get this nice sort of reactive behavior here that's fully driven by math. So we don't have any sort of kind of periodic functions. We're not using noise. We're not using any keyframes or bones or rigs or anything like that. We're just using some very basic math and a really trivial idea that if you contract one side and expand the other, then you get a bend. And so that gives us this kind of fun effect here. Now, right now we're not getting any collision with this ball. That would be easy enough to fix, but I might not necessarily go through that in this tutorial because I think we've covered a lot already. But what you would do is just turn this into a FEM object. And as long as this thing had a target that it was following, you could have it colliding with these things. And oh, what the hell? Let's actually just do that. It's actually quite quick. So I can take this sphere. It's already let's turn it into polygons. Let's give it a little bit of resolution. Actually, that's probably just fine at 2. I want to make it a bit smaller. That's looking fine. Let's do a solid form. Pipe that through here. We don't need this anymore. That was just for visualization. So now we're bringing these tetrahedra through. And what we can do here is just do a time shift. And if we lock ourselves at frame 1, this will be our base geometry. So I'm going to call this ball base. And this will be ball target. Now we can go in here and just bring in another solid object. Merge those together and they should both sort of respond separately. This one we're going to point to our base. And then we're going to go down here and we're going to allow target deformation and we're going to point to that target. And I'm going to bring up this strength pretty high. I'll allow the target damping at this point because we actually want this entire ball to be sort of getting updated by this movement. With that in place, that should be all that we need because in here we're already restricted to the tentacles group, so none of this will ever apply to the ball, so we don't have to worry about our SOP solver. The only other thing I want here is our target now. We could follow that point, and in fact, actually, yeah, it is easiest to follow that point. What you could do is basically take this entire set of geometry and just look for the nearest point and be drawn towards that, but it's all centered around this point anyway, so it probably makes the most sense to just leave it that way. So now we should have this ball, and it's still going to be moving around because it's got a really strong target constraint here. Because this value is really strong, it's going to be following that constraint really tightly. If we dropped this way down to something like 100, this ball will probably start to fall. It's basically not really able to follow its target constraints well enough because they're not strong enough. So it's being pushed around by other forces a lot more. But as long as we have this nice and high, this ball should follow its course relatively well, but if it ends up sort of running into any of these tentacles, now instead of just passing through them, let's make sure we didn't catch any of that. I just want to see a collision here somewhere. Escaped there. Instead of passing through them, though, it should now just be able to collide with them. So let's just wait to see if we have an example. Yeah, sure enough, in this part here, I think previously it might have sort of collided or overlapped. But you can see that now this tentacle is not passing through it, it's actually bumping into it, and we get this little bend here. And so all we really need to do to get collision is to allow them into the same simulation the way we have here. And now the tentacles won't pass through each other, and the tentacles won't sort of pass through the ball, and we get this nice sort of behavior. So that's all I wanted to cover in this tutorial. I hope you guys have learned a couple of things. I think the FEM solver is really quite powerful, and it's actually not quite so difficult as it maybe seems at first glance. It behaves quite differently from a lot of the other solvers, so it can be a little bit weird to get your head around it at first. But it's actually quite fast, quite robust, and it does some really, really interesting things once you get a hang of it. So I hope that this gave you at least a tiny window into some of the things that you can do with it. As always, the HIP file for this will be available on my website, and I would love to hear it if you use this for anything, if you make something cool. Leave a comment below if you have any questions or suggestions or things you'd like to see next, or if you just want to say hi or sort of say that you've enjoyed this. I always love reading those. Otherwise, thank you very much, and I will see you next time.